Okay, quick show of hands. Who here has invested in tech companies or a company, not real estate, restaurants, whatever, show of hands? Who here would like to invest, to be an investor? Not that many. What? Who here is already affiliated with Operator Collective? Okay. All right, well, let's have you guys tell a little bit about what the new fund is and what makes it new and different. So Mallun, do you want to kick things off maybe?
Sure. So maybe it helps to start as to why we put this together in the first place, which is that, as you may be aware, the venture world tends to be very insular and exclusive. It's very hard to break into. And I thought, well, gosh, there's got to be a way to change that. And so having been an outsider for much of my life, when you're an outsider, you spend a lot of time observing. And so there was a number of things that I observed, which is the venture world revolves around VCs and founders, with good reason, because there would be no companies without them. But operators, operating executives, the people who grow, build, and scale companies, are really not even on the radar. They don't know them. And when you look at VCs and founders, VCs are over 90% of them are male, and 85% of founders are male as well. And when you look at the enterprise, which is the area that Leyla and I focus on, business to business, it's even higher. And so when you look at that, there's a couple of other things, which is that they're largely male, they're largely VCs and founders, they don't know the operators, and you tend to know people like you. And then the second part of it is that most business to business startups want to eventually sell to the enterprise because those are the big companies. And most VCs and founders have actually never worked in the enterprise. And so when we looked at this problem, this is why the forces have kept a number of operators and a lot of diverse operators, which we'll talk about in a second, out of the picture, is I thought, gosh, if we could find a way to bring into venture the very people that venture needs to be successful in a way that's natural, and when you sprinkle in there, by the way, if they can be underrepresented and represent other genders as well, then that's how we can disrupt the venture and actually make it more naturally inclusive in a way that actually reflects what our society looks like.
So it's interesting because some of the numbers, you now have amassed more than 100 LPs, limited partners, who've put money into this fund that you're launching officially today. Thanks. And these are incredibly accomplished, mostly women, 90% female, and I think 40% of them people of color. They're from the tech companies that you would all recognize and have heard of, but a very large percentage of them, about 3/4, have not invested in the past. And I'm not talking, of course, about becoming VCs, but angel investing, as a limited partner or whatever. Talk about why that is. What's been your experience? This is your network.
Right. So I came at it from a slightly different angle. I was an executive vice president at Salesforce, just left there recently. And sometime back, it became really clear to me that there was, I was one of the women that went to Mark Benioff and said, you're not paying the women the same as the men. So equal pay has always been on the front of my mind. And something that became obvious to me was as we were buying companies and the founders would stay for a while and then they'd leave, often they'd leave and become venture capitalists. And they would call back the male executives and say, give me some money for my fund, invest in this, invest in that. And so a new income stream developed for a lot of the male executives that the women weren't being necessarily cut into. So when Mallun came up with this and we started talking about this, it became a really natural extension to start to get more women, more underrepresented minorities into venture, because venture is where the kings and the queens are made, right? The venture capitalists are the people who decide what companies are going to ultimately be super successful. So if we want different companies, then we need different venture capitalists sometimes.
So you brought up equal pay, and one of the interesting things about Operator Collective is that you have kind of a sliding scale of who can be involved and who can contribute into the fund. Can you talk about the decision to do that and sort of how the equal pay background kind of fed into how you approach this?
So let me explain first. So because a venture fund, the way it works is actually not apparent to most people if you're not in venture. So you have limited partners who are investors in the fund, and then the fund decides which companies to invest in. And so for us, so for the typical venture fund, you often have institutions or large family offices who are investors in the fund. But for what we did is we have a large number of operating executives, of which 90% are women, 40% are people of color, who are investors in the fund. And so we knew when we were raising money to put together this fund, we wanted to make this accessible to a wide group of people for whom venture was not accessible before. And so we put together a sliding scale at the lower end, depending on a number of factors, which Leyla can explain in a second. It's actually $10,000, which is almost unheard of in the venture world. Of course, at the high end, we've got million-plus contributors as well. But we intentionally wanted to have a sliding scale because if you don't do that, you end up with the same people. Maybe we're going to disrupt, right, the existing homogenous group with a little other homogenous group of white and Asian people, right? And so we wanted to be able to say, okay, can we bring people from different backgrounds, and this is what they're able to contribute.
And so this, I mean, clearly equal pay is a big part of my life. It will forever be. But we had someone in particular that I really wanted in the fund. Mallun really wanted in the fund. She just couldn't enter. She had not been given the opportunities throughout her career. And because of that, we came up with the scale, which has given us a lot of flexibility and allowed us to really diversify the fund, which was the main objective.
Okay. The size of the fund, at least as it stands, I realize it's still open, but is at $45 million. That is not a drop in the bucket for most people in the world, but in Silicon Valley it is, with all these mega funds going on and money elsewhere as well, of course. Talk about how you plan to compete for deals in that climate.
Great. So
we're not having much trouble competing for deals right now. I mean, I don't mean to sound sort of crass, and then Mallun can give you the more appropriate answer. We're different.
They complement each other.
Very good compliment.
We couldn't
she gets to be funny and charismatic, and
she's very detail-oriented and tells me not to say things all the time. It works really well. We're a good pair. But we really, when we started thinking through this, we definitely were thinking about how the fund is actually much different because we have this group of 100+ operators. They are engaged in the fund. Now, they all have jobs and they're doing different stuff, but they do diligence with us. They join companies on boards. They advise. So what we came up with, and Mallun really came up with this initially, was this idea that we would leverage the people that are operating the most successful companies in the world to build the next generation.
And so we're operators.
This is the Mallun version now.
Yeah, now it's like the more pro, yeah.
So we're operators, and one of the things we do as operators, we know how to build products, we know how to build businesses, we know how to build immediate product market fit. And so we actually did that exactly here too, which is we looked at what the gap is in the venture ecosystem, which is operators, women, and people of color. And so we thought, look, if we could bring together the best operators around, that actually the founders and VCs want to bring them into venture, there's just not a natural way to bring them in because forced diversity doesn't work. You have to figure out a way to bring these networks of people in that typically don't intersect and make it natural to work. So we knew that if we could do that, we would have immediate product market fit and that founders would want us to fund their companies and VCs would want us to co-invest with them because you don't do it alone. Even a VC does not take an entire round by themselves. And so we did that intentionally, and we did that the way that we would build any product. In fact, the very DNA of this venture fund is not the way you would approach a typical venture fund, but literally the way you would build a company. What's the gap? What's the product market fit? How do you make it easy or attractive for founders to take your money? How do you make it easy for current active operators now to be able to participate? And that's what we did.
Okay, questions from the audience. Raise your hand and we'll bring you a microphone. Anybody who has a question or a comment? We have one over there. If you could introduce yourself, please.
Hi, I'm Deirdre from TIAA. Can you tell us a little bit? I mean, we have a sense of who your investor base is. Where can we sign up?
You can go to our website.
Tell us more about your ideal investor. So you saw how many people in this room did not raise their hand as having invested or even thinking about investing. And I don't think that necessarily means that they wouldn't be interested. So I'm curious as to how you are trying to reach that group of operators.
So we'll answer that question in a second, but it is very typical because as busy operators, and a lot of us in the fund and otherwise, and maybe in this room, have small kids at home. And so as women, we are so conditioned to be perfect at everything. And so perfect at your job. You give 150% to your day job. You're conditioned to be perfect at home with your family or your friends. And so it's not even on the radar to even say, oh, can I even have the capacity to start investing, especially when your circles don't intersect with the VCs and founders who don't look like you and don't run around in the same networks as you do. And so it's very typical. But once you start thinking about it, you're like, well, why am I not doing this? Because you have so many skills that are valuable. You have pattern recognition as to what's going to be the next great company, and that we're missing out on that. And so one example is one individual who's at Fortune MPW who I met and had the first conversation. When she first started, she's grown revenue from 0 to 500 million in the enterprise. Very rare. Took a company public, et cetera. Until we started talking about Operator Collective and this idea at Fortune MPW, actually.
Thanks for all the plugs.
It was literally at the chef dinner that we had last night, but a couple years ago. And when I asked, she had never invested. She was sort of interested in it. But now that she's invested, she's made 5 other investments on her own, too. And she's phenomenal. And so that's sort of the tee up. But the way to get involved is Fund Run is largely closed, but there will be a Fund 2 in the future. And we hope that you become part of the community. So even if you haven't invested, we hope that every single one of you logs onto the website, fills in the information so we have access to you. And so when we have events, because it's about education, it's very important to us that we educate these people who it's not even on the radar either way, and start that way. And please come to our events and be a part of this.
And I mean, one thing, Michal sort of mentioned this, but over 70% of the people in our fund have never invested before. And when we asked them why, they said because no one ever asked. So we are asking you to think about investing. And you can join our community, and when we raise another fund, perhaps that will be it. But at the very least, we will help educate you on what that means, because there's a lot of money to be made out there that we should all be getting a cut of. And we're definitely, that's a big part of our mission.
So there's one point I also want to make, because before I started venture investing, I was like you, I hadn't really thought about it. And sometimes when I talk about being an outsider, sometimes when you're an outsider and you're looking in and venture seems so like glitzy, right? It's the Midas list and this list and this list. It seems so hard to access. And in fact, I helped take a company public and grew it from 0 to 100 million in less than 3 years from founding. We eventually grew it to 300 million in revenue, all in the enterprise. But when I started to dip my toe into venture, I was actually a little surprised that I actually had skills that people thought were valuable. Mm-hmm. Because in some ways it's so innate to what you do that you're like, oh, well, how do they not know this? But then when you dip your toe, in this case into enterprise investing, I'm like, oh, never worked in a big company, never actually built anything. And so as I found that, I was like, okay, I know a lot of people like me because you tend to know people like you. And so I said, what if we could bring in all these amazing operators, all this amazing talent, and because you tend to know people like you, they're mostly women, people of color.
By the way, just to go back to some of the numbers, over 70% have not invested of the limited partners in the fund, but nearly 50% of these, mostly women, have worked for companies that, or helped start companies that have been acquired. 41% of them have worked at startups that have gone public, and 44% have scaled their respective companies to 1 billion. So it's a good group.
Yeah, total ownership. I mean, they've managed over 150,000 people. They've managed over $60 billion in revenue. Like it's the people running the valley. Yeah. You just don't know.
Day to day. Yep. Yeah. Okay, so we do need to wrap up in just a few seconds here, but very, very quickly. You've made 5 investments. What are you most excited about? I know you're focusing mostly enterprise, but very, very quick.
You go first.
So I am super excited about being able to bring together this great talent that wants to be a part of it, but maybe it wasn't accessible, they didn't know about it. But on the founder and VC side, they are so excited about this too, right? It was not like anyone was trying to keep everyone separate. And one other point there is that as a first-time venture fund, it's very unusual to get what's called institutional money from foundations and endowments. We have universities and foundations who have invested in Fund 1. The climate is changing. Yeah. And it's through a lot of work that everyone has done, what Fortune has done, that has allowed us to be able to get to this point to say, okay, we're ready, and we're going to do this, and the people have embraced it.
Okay, we do need to wrap, but very quickly, show of hands, who now wants to invest?
Yay!
Good job, Mallun.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so very much. See you guys over there.